Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. I interrupt this intro to celebrate the imminent arrival of the movie 28 Years Later, coming this Friday. If you don't know, it's the third movie in the series started by 28 Days Later. The second one was, predictably, 28 weeks later, which is still less time than most orgs take to patch phones. But zombie movies aren't appealing, at least to me, because of the number of undead in them, nor are AppSec programs useful because of the number of CVEs they track. Really good ones are about how people respond and band together. So whether the head you're aiming for is a zombie or a Git repo, don't forget to have a strategy that avoids a horde of threats in the first place. Which means this week we talk with Farshad Abasi about threat modeling, what makes it an ignorable chore, and what makes it useful. Count the days and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Think your terminal emulation is secure? Think again. Passwords and firewalls alone won't protect you. Cyber threats are evolving, and so should your security. Rocket Secure Host Access gives you phishing-resistant, password-free protection with leading-edge encryption. Your mission-critical systems deserve more than good enough. Secure your green screen access and stay ahead of the threat. Rocket Secure Host Access. The future of TE is now. Learn more at securityweekly.com/rocketsoftware. This is episode 335, recorded June 16th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, I was just sort of wondering, why don't they have more threat bounties in those horror movies?
Oh, that's a good question. All right, I'll do some research. I'll go through my list of zombie movies. And while I'm putting that together, I have to say hello to Kalyani. We've got Kalyani this week. How you doing?
Hello, everyone. Actually, 28 Days Later was the first zombie movie I ever watched. It was terrifying.
It's a good way to start. We'll have to go back to the Romero classics, but we'll have time for that. Speaking of other classics, we have Farshad Abasi, who's a friend of the show, been here on a couple times. He's the founder and CEO of Forward Security, bringing over 27 years, almost 28 years later, look at that, of industry experience to cybersecurity innovation. He's an instructor at BCIT and an active member in the BSIDES and OWASP communities around Vancouver, and here on the airwaves with us. Hello, Farshad. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Good to be on the show again.
Happy to have you here. And we wanted to talk as a group about threat modeling, because it's one of those things that, and I think you're going to tell us about this, it always shows up on a panel or a discussion at an AppSec conference. Everybody talks about it, but I'm kind of curious how many people actually do it. So before we get into a couple of the acronyms, Farshad, tell us a little bit about, a PDF that you put together, and that seems to be talking about training threat modeling, but maybe trying to do a little bit of a different approach. Why do we need a different approach?
That's a really good question. So Mike, when I got into application security, the first project I got assigned to was a threat modeling project. So I have been doing AppSec now, for 17 years. 2008 was my switch from a software developer to an application security or product security engineer, whatever you want to call it at the time. And my boss was like, "Hey, welcome to the team. And, here's your first project. You got to do threat modeling on it." And prior to actually starting the week before, I went and bought Adam Shostak's book because I knew nothing about threat modeling. The job description was like, "Hey, you're going to be working in this team, and threat modeling is one of the things you got to do." So I went and bought the book. I think it was from Amazon, and dived right in. And of course, pretty grateful for the work that Adam did. Have a lot of respect for that, and it's used globally by a lot of companies. And of course, we adopted that process within where I worked at the time, large financial institution, and we didn't have a big AppSec team. It was just in its infancy, in fact. And so, I dived in and, faced that challenge. And that in that first project, I identified about 70 plus different threat scenarios and recognizing, hey, maybe this isn't the right way that I'm doing this. And, there was a lot of lessons learned. I continued to learn and learn and learn and learn over the coming months in that company. And then after about a year, we tried to formalize our threat modeling process and roll it globally. And when I joined them, we were loosely using ISF, the International Security Foundation, a European organization. They have the IRAM model, which is their risk assessment methodology, but it includes some threat modeling. So we were using that, but it was loose, and not everyone was marching to the same rhythm and doing things consistently. So saw a lot of challenges, and made it my mission to improve all of that. So here we go, 17 years later. I've learned a lot, and I'm hoping to change some things here in how people do threat modeling. But I think what you were mentioning is lots of people talk about it, but how many people are actually doing it and doing it right? I think before the show, you and I were talking about Stride and what people's understanding is of that, right? Stride is something that comes up in every threat modeling conversation, but in my experience, the majority of people don't even understand it correctly. That's one of my pet peeves.
Well, that's
if you look
interesting.
it up,
Yeah, and I wanted to dive into that because you set up you set up the idea of there's a process you want to roll out globally. You want to be able to have people use this. So there's definitely three themes that we're going to come around to. But Stride, you went and said you started out and you bought, Adam Shostad's book. How come you didn't just start? Stride is 5 words. Why didn't you just start with Stride? That's easy.
Let's talk about what is Stride. Maybe ask you a question. What is Stride for you?
Stride. Well, man, I'm the host here. I'll ask the questions, but you put me on the spot. No, Stride to me, as I said, it's 5 words. Spoofing, tampering, repudiation, and the repudiation doesn't even have a lot of applicability for most scenarios. So for me, it's just like I said, I'm going to repeat myself, unfortunately. 5 words to keep in mind about what should we be worried about or what could go wrong. But to tease it out a little bit more, it's not a process. It's not like, do you just go through in alphabetical order? Do you have to hit all 5 letters? And then, of course, there's even dread. But since I'm in a movie mood today, dread's dead, baby. Dread's dead for you Pulp Fiction fans out there. But nobody even uses it. And I, for one, can't even remember what it stands for. But to me, these are just things to keep in mind about that, what could go wrong. And so I'll turn around to to John Kalyani and you, Farshad, as well. How do you start a threat model in a way that is already that you think is going to either signal to developers that this is going to be useful for them, or is going to elicit a conversation that works? And I'll start with you, Farshad. Do you actually start and say, let's have Stride, or tell me about Stride when you talk to the developers? What's the first question you do there?
Not necessarily.
Sorry,
Yeah.
John.
So the one thing I want to say right off the bat is Stride is not a threat modeling process. Let's make that really clear, right? A lot of people are like, how do you do threat modeling? Do you follow Stride? There is no method for Stride. It's not a methodology. It's a classification scheme. So when you do find those threat scenarios, or if you want to start thinking about them, you can think of those classifications. And as you were saying, Mike, it can help you. Hey, did I think of all the potential spoofing issues, right? It's just a way to open doors. And then if you do find stuff, you could classify them and go, hey, I found this many spoofing issues and this many information disclosure issues, right? So it's just sort of a conversation starter to think, have I thought about those kinds of things? Did I give it a consideration? And if I didn't, maybe I should, right? Did I think of information disclosure? Maybe I should.
Well, and that's one of my questions too, because there is this important aspect of a conversation starter, but people's time is important to them. And, we as an AppSec team want to be respectful of developers' time. And even here on this segment, we're limited to roughly 30 minutes. We only have a little bit of time with you, Farshad. And the reason I'm going through this is we could have this conversation about, hey, have you thought about information disclosure? But is that the most important question? How do we ask the most important question or useful questions to kick off a threat modeling exercise?
Yeah, but before I answer that, I also want to add to that is that what type of threat modeling are we doing, right? Because I think this, what we're having this conversation is around traditional threat modeling, which I call architecture threat modeling, right? How useful is that? I mean, architecture threat modeling, sure, you put the architecture diagram in front of you or DFD, look at it once, but it's not the architecture that's changing every day. It's the developers in modern dev teams, they're pumping out user stories. Those user stories may or may not change architecture. In fact, most of the time, they're not changing the architecture. They're introducing new functions, right? So one of the things I learned in the beginning is you got to decompose your application for threat modeling, and you decompose it into its components, into its architectural components. You also identify the interfaces, the data stores, and then you got to also decompose it into functions. And the functional part is the part that is sort of often missed on people. Like, sure, they do the architecture threat modeling. They show the diagrams. Here's the links. Oh yeah, someone could compromise this link, or someone could intercept it, et cetera, et cetera. That's all fine and dandy. But what about the functions? If you dig into the functions, the application has hundreds of functions. And so often it's not a good idea to do that functional threat modeling when you're doing architecture threat modeling, because A, you may not have built all the functions, and B, if it's a legacy application, you have built all the functions, there's hundreds of functions to go through. So the better approach is to do it iteratively. As you're coming up with the user stories on those functions, you're doing evil story threat modeling, which is a bit of a different beast than traditional architecture.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit and sort of repeat back to you, if you will. The architecture feels more, that's the exploration of the boundaries. Where do we think a security boundary is? Where should or should not sensitive data pass through or cross tenants, cross users? Functional, I do want to tease that out a bit more, because it also feels that we could say, well, functional threat modeling, do you mean just where did you do your input validation? Have you, is threat modeling asking, okay, here's function A, did you consider cross-site scripting? What about function B? What about function C? And we could go through the alphabet and everybody could fall asleep by the time I get to letter G by this point. That doesn't seem like the right way of functional when you're talking about functions. So let's tease that out more for AppSec folks and for the developers, when to say, what do you mean there? Like, what are some good examples of threats that you'd want to tease out, or problems that you'd want to tease out?
You also actually just hit on an important point that I almost forgot to bring. So let's talk about that functional threat modeling. So what I mean by that is taking the system functions. So as a user, let's say it's a banking system, right? We say as a user, I should be able to view all of my own transactions, right? That's a happy path. But I should not be able to view other people's transactions, right? You're building a function, you're building a feature in the application to do the transaction summary. But when you're building that feature, did you think of ways that it could be possible for people to view other people's transactions, right? So that's what I'm referring to functional threat modeling, is taking the system apart into all of its features or functions and making sure that you've considered the abuse cases or the evil scenarios. Now, what you were talking about is that cross-site scripting. That's a really good example of a cross-cutting concern, I call it, or you can call it something else. But those are things that it would apply to almost every function or every user story. So, those like authorization. Has this user been authorized before permitting access to function A, B, or C? Has the input been validated? So there are things that are cross-cutting across most of your user stories. Those are the things that you should be looking at, it perhaps at an architecture level. Hey, when I'm building our system, does every screen do output encoding, right? That isn't necessarily a per feature or per function discussion. That's a cross-cutting concern that should be applied to every user story, if you will.
And it feels like that's the good example of have that discussion around the architecture choices, or just what is this class of vulnerability that we'll get rid of? And you've mentioned, like, do we have an architecture diagram? Do we have a data flow diagram? Do we have user stories? I think of those three, I have an idea that 2 out of 3 of those are tend to be mythological creatures that never exist. I'm curious, John, I know you've done a lot of work on development and working with engineering groups. Of an architecture diagram, a DFD, and user stories, which one of those do you tend to actually see the most that is a decent start to start with threat modeling?
See, that the last part of that question there is what sort of upsets me or upsets my answer. So what would I prefer to see versus what do I see, right? I'm going to partially fall back to my old standard response of it's partially going to depend on the maturity of the team I'm working with. It's very easy in your design docs to throw in a few boxes and there's your architecture and data in, data out, you're done. But I think like from my consulting days, or like when I'm even nowadays when I'm working with pen test teams, if the number one thing that's most valuable to me is seeing a data flow diagram, or if I'm like working with another partner team and I'm trying to figure out how our application worked with their applications, like how do I get data through that? So to me, that's numero uno. Because I mean, I think that also sort of identifies where do you start looking, where's the soft spots of this particular application? Where are we going to start poking at and things like that? So at least for me, that's what I both prefer to see or create. And if it doesn't exist, that's almost better still, right? 'Cause then that's, as first I was saying, that's your introduction conversation of like, okay, well, what are we dealing with here? Okay, you've got this thing, you've got data, it's coming in, and you can sort of tell a user story while you're designing that on a whiteboard. But that's my preferred way to do it.
Yeah, and I like that because where are the soft spots? That's a synonym of what's the worst could go wrong. Maybe I snuck worst in there, but that's a great way to start the conversation. And Farshad, one of the questions was, how do you start this conversation? And if you have a DFD, awesome. If you just got user stories, great. But you did mention, I think you called them evil cases, or I like to call them abuse cases instead of use cases. What do those look like? Or how would you start with those user stories and get some of these questions going?
Yeah. So to answer your question, let's step back a little bit. So in so I believe threat modeling should be done across the entire DevOps chain. So when you're starting an application, hey, you're thinking of the architecture. Hey, I'm going to build this thing in AWS. I'm going to have a couple of VPCs, some microservices go here and there, and then here's a data flow for my architecture. Sure, you do that. Maybe the architecture changes a little bit over time, but most cases I've seen the architecture doesn't change dramatically once you've got that initial architecture done up. So that level stuff like the data flow diagrams, physical architecture diagrams in a C4 type of environment come in handy. You can use tools like there's Structureize. It's a tool. There's diagrams that does it, diagramming as code. So there are tools that you could generate. You could even take infrastructure as code like Terraform or CloudFormation to try to automate the creation of those diagrams. But that's stage one, right? Let's call that architecture threat modeling. Now you go and start building the system, the function 1, function 2, right? In my example of internet banking application, now you go make that screen that shows the transaction summary. And then, or you make the next screen that shows the transaction details or the place where the user can make payments. Those aren't necessarily architectural conversations. Those are user story conversations, or let's call them requirements conversations if this was waterfall, right? In the waterfall world, you would get a list of requirements. Say my system should do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. In the new world, you get these user stories that say, as a user, I should be able to do X, Y, Z, right? So this is the second stage. Let's call that sort of your user story threat modeling. This is where writing abuse cases or evil stories come in. Here, diagrams don't help so much, like the data flow diagram, because you're not looking at a flow across components. You're looking mostly at a specific feature or function of the application. So what you got to do there is you got to have a well-defined user story, which is often, and I'm sure John, Mike, you've also seen this, and Callie, and often developers don't refine the user stories very well, right? Look, we work with clients where in their ticket, it's just like half of a sentence. It's like, well, I can't do much with this. So in order for that to be successful, it's not about diagrams, it's about well-defined user stories or well-refined, let's call it, right? So if the refinement has been done and there's enough detail in that user story, then you could come up with an acceptable evil story or the unhappy path or abuse case, whatever you want to call it, depending on how you write it.
What if we... go ahead.
No, I insist you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, sort of turning in as an example, kind of a workshop, the idea of a user story, say that starts with, as a user, I want to transfer money. That seems a bit underdefined, perhaps, but so maybe help me understand, or help our listeners understand, how do we turn, I want to transfer some money as part of our banking app into a better user story, as well as that evil user story or a threat modeling that feels like a good use of our developers' time. That's going to lead to at least hopefully some change or some awareness about security.
Yeah, I think taking your example, Mike, it would be in that particular case, the happy path would be, as a user, I would like to transfer money from one of my accounts to a beneficiary that's known to me. That would be a user story. Hey, I'm going to move from one of my accounts to someone that I know. But I should not be able to move money from any account within the bank to anyone out there. So that would be the unhappy path, is if I'm able to transfer, if I can put the source of that to be anyone's account and the destination to be anywhere, then that, can cause security issues. So that would be the unhappy path, or the abuse case. It'd be, as an attacker, I could use this function to put anyone's bank account number and as a source, and put anyone's destination bank account number, and be able to move money that way. So that would be the abuse case, or the evil story, if you will, in that scenario.
And I'm curious too, Kalyani, you worked with especially small teams, and this is where my thinking comes around to your areas of focus, startups. As you're listening to, for example, Farshad and I have this conversation about the user stories and teasing out the different threat models just of transferring money. And is it a beneficiary I know? What if we add it? Well, I don't know. Or it's like, do I know the coffee shop I'm buying coffee from? Does that count as somebody I know, et cetera? A lot of ways we could tear this apart. From developer perspective, and from your small AppSec team perspective, does it feel like we're just going through an exercise for the sake of exercise, or are we getting someplace that feels like you would say is getting useful? How does a threat model turn useful, or what does it produce that becomes useful in your eyes?
Okay. So we were talking about features a while ago, right? And how I think in startups it's mostly feature-driven threat modeling more than like, okay, this is an architecture diagram and this is an RFC and we're going to go threat model this. For an efficient threat modeling exercise, obviously, I would love to have a whiteboard and all of us sit in the same room and have a nice conversation and draw the diagram out. But unfortunately, not everybody's available at the same time. I think when it comes to startups, the most effective way to make sure that your product is threat model is if you can quantify that in terms of business impact. Is this business critical? Is it safety critical? Or like you said, what is the worst that can happen here? And if we have an answer to that, we absolutely should dedicate resources to it. Like we've had this conversation before where it's just like, we hate the dump and run approach, where it's just like, okay, there's like 400 things that are wrong with your app. And that prescriptive approach is going to make all the developers cumulatively hate you day in, day out. And yeah, it's not helping anyone, right? So, but instead, out of all those 400 mitigation things that came out of the threat model, if we could just categorize with respect to what are the top 5 that'll make us go to sleep at night peacefully. And if we work on them, I think that's the right way to deal with that startups. But that also makes me think, and this is a question for you, Farshad, which is, what do you think is like the minimum viable threat modeling workflow for a fast-paced environment? Like this is the bare minimum that should happen for you to be able to ship it. And if you don't, development jail, velocity jail.
I've got a counter to this one.
Yeah. Kalyani, you hit some really good points there, right? Like, we should always think of impact rather than just try to threat model and fix everything. It should be impact and risk. Let's call it risk, right? Because impact and likelihood give risk. One of the things that we do, and this is a practice I took from the previous big company that I've worked at, is always starting with business impact before you even, and looking at who the attackers are. Having that initial conversation. Hey, what are we threat modeling? Who's interested? What are the assets? And are these assets something that are super juicy and a nation state's going to be after it? Or are these things that are not maybe super juicy and only script kiddies are going to be after it, right? So depending on the answer, you got to right size your threat modeling and how far zoom in. The other thing is that even if you're a big company, like, the resources are always in short supply, right? Like, so where I worked, we were the 3rd largest bank in the world, and we still had a shortage of people that could do this kind of threat modeling work, right? AppSec people are hard to find. OWASP says that for every AppSec specialist, there are 125 developers. So I had a really small team. So for me to assign lots of resources to the dev team to hold their hand and threat model everything, it was just not possible. So, what we realized is you got to pick and choose your battles. So what we created was a checklist. And, in fact, we use that in our consulting engagements with a lot of the startups that we consult with, is say, hey, take all the user stories that are going to go in that sprint, run them through this checklist, And if any of them is answered as yes, that's worth threat modeling, right? And that could be like, does this particular feature handle credit cards or people's really sensitive data? Is this particular feature directly externally facing? It was a list of, 10 or a dozen questions that we came up with. And then we said, hey, developers, before you dive in and do all the threat modeling work, run this checklist to user story. If the answer is yes on that user story, then that user story goes in a special bucket that you call us, and then we come and help you do the threat modeling. Otherwise, we don't have time. In fact, one project that I was assigned to at the big bank, every sprint, they had 70 user stories. There was no way. I'd allocated 1.5 full-time team members on that project. There was no way we could do it all. And this is where the idea of the checklist came out, is like, let's have a filter on those user stories so that we filter the ones that are security sensitive and just really work on those based on risk.
Yeah. I'm definitely getting worried about checklists because it leads us to spreadsheets and so many.
I hate spreadsheets.
and so many. We can play the game. We'll have to have Adrian Sanabria on from ESW. We'll play the game. Is this a SaaS vendor or is it a spreadsheet? Often indistinguishable. But part of where I'm going with that is tools. You did mention tools a little bit. I'm curious what everybody thinks here too, because for me to start, the most successful tool that I've found is not quite the whiteboard that Kalyani mentioned, but just honestly a doc and just with bullet points to go through. And that has felt 90%, 99% sufficient for me. But that could be a particular preference. I'm curious what the rest of you think about that. And let me throw over to John first too, because I know he loves to share his ideas.
PowerPoint. Let me say that one more time clearly so people hear and cringe. PowerPoint. There goes half of my coworkers jumping off the ledge. I'm with Kalyani. I want a whiteboard. I want something simple. Docs. If your company where you're at has a documentation culture, I think that's part of it, is like, what's the culture of your company? But if you're in a doc culture, sure, write a doc. If you're fast-paced, but hopefully not too fast-paced, grab like a piece of paper or whiteboard or something, or like hop on Zoom and do like the whiteboard in there. And just, it has to be, the point to me is not the tool. And we've had, like, I think about a year and a half ago, we had like a long discussion about tools, possibly with Farshad. But get the tools for me out of the way. Don't act like an engineer. Just let's communicate. Let's have a chat. Let's figure out what's going on with this piece and actually look at it from that point of view. And like, I'm not even talking like, don't even mention like a line of code or a language. Just like, what is this thing doing? And then you start zooming down into, okay, well, that's what it's doing. How does it do it in this language or this framework? Or if we had more time, I'd come back to talk about the cloud stuff because I think that's really interesting. But yeah, start high and then sort of filter down into it.
Yeah, Farshad, is that you've mentioned tools, and we don't necessarily have to try and say this is vendor tool, open source tool, or that. But I guess part of it is what value have you found from tools, or where have you found value out of a different tool that isn't just a doc like I was advocating? We can pretend that PowerPoint is still on the list, but I will say a whiteboard is on the list too.
Yeah, it's funny because when I went into this whole threat modeling world back in 2008. I was like, hey, there's got to be tools that can help you make this easier, right? So, of course, I tried the Microsoft threat modeling tool, and I ran away pretty quickly. It's like I'm not talking about those kinds of tools. And why did I run away? Is because a tool like the Microsoft threat modeling one or the other ones that I've seen, they ask you a bunch of questions, and then they create every possible permutation and combination of all the things, and they give you hundreds of threat scenarios. It's like, I'm not looking for this. I'm like looking for realistic 5 or 6 threat scenarios that really tell me the story, right? And I've revisited the Microsoft threat modeling tool over the years, and it's still the same. It just so noisy, gives you every possibility. That's not the kind of tool you need, right? So let's go back to when should you be doing threat modeling? In my opinion, there's 3 types of threat modeling, right? The whiteboarding and the stuff that we've been talking about, that's traditional threat modeling. That's done at the architecture level, data flows and things like that. Great. You got to do that kind of upfront, right? But then when you go to the user story, there is no diagram. When you're talking about that, hey, like I'm building a feature that shows all the transactions for my credit card. There is nothing to diagram there. That's more of a conversation, is that like, what does this function do? What is it supposed to do? Oh, it's supposed to move money. Well, how does it move money? Well, you put in a variable that shows the beneficiary and the source of the money and moves. It's just really understanding that function and then poking at it, right? But then as Kalyani pointed out, startups are not going to have time to do that for every user story. So this is where, some sort of a checklist, and I hate to use that term, Mike, because it's the worst, right? Clients ask us all the time, hey, can you give me a checklist for my developers? And the answer is, well, ASVS is the ultimate checklist, but there's 280 items on there. So what the next thing the clients ask us, hey, can you give us a smaller checklist, right? So at HSBC, or the place I used to work, the name came out, I guess I used to work there. But what we did is we came up with patterns. So we had security architecture patterns. We're like, hey, here's all the possible patterns, right? You guys have heard of design patterns in software engineering. There's only a certain number of patterns that can happen here. So we started creating those patterns. Hey, if you have a MVC web application pattern, these are the checklists for you. If you're building a move money pattern, these are the checklist items for you. If you're building an API, there's a checklist for you. But again, so what we did is took apart the big checklist and make smaller ones for different use cases or different patterns. We've done that for our clients today as well. Clients ask us, give me a checklist. I'm like, well, here's the cross-cutting items from ASVS. Here's the API ones, et cetera, et cetera. But even that's a lot of work, right? So in fact, recently, a colleague of mine, having been frustrated by this request, he built a little AI tool. It goes into your Jira, it plugs in, and it looks at the user story, and then it analyzes the user story, and it gives you exactly the specific checklist items from ASVS that you need to do. So that kind of thing starts to get better rather than this manual checklist or filter list. So we're going to see an uptick of AI-enabled tools, and I'm happy to share ours once it's polished off. Right now, it's still in the polishing stages, but those are the kinds of things we need to automate and get out of spreadsheets and get out of those situations and go faster.
I think that's a great use of LLMs. I want to hit one last topic, or at least one last topic from me before we move on. It feels like the use cases we've been talking about over the last 20, 30 minutes are really for new applications. Very frequently when I engage with testing teams now, I'll try and stay generic, but when I engage with them, it's like, hey, we're adding this big new feature to our application. One of the questions which always comes up is when do we engage the AppSec team? When do we actually want to bring them in and actually look at something new? And what does that conversation look like? Are you still going back to the basic idea of doing the whiteboard or the tools, or is it a more colloquial, casual conversation? Or I know Kalyani, you, Farshad, either way, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Go ahead, Kalyani. I can go after.
If we're talking about legacy applications, I feel like they put some fear in me, but I think, and this is how I view this question. I think for legacy applications, again, if it is working and it does not need to be touched, and if it is not going to break anything, let it just live. If it is not, again, I go back to my whole risk matrix, but I believe Farshad is the expert here, so I'm going to put this to Farshad.
That sounds good. So taking a legacy application that's already been built, right? That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do the architecture threat modeling. So I'm going to stick to my 3 phases of threat modeling: architecture level threat modeling, requirement, functional, user story threat modeling, whatever you want to call it. And then this threat modeling that's done after design, right? Those first 2 are during design. You still haven't built anything yet. But once you start coding it, new threat scenarios are introduced. So you need to do threat modeling at all the stages, and they look different, right? Like when you're doing architecture threat modeling, you're looking at DFDs. When you're doing the user story threat modeling, you're looking at user stories or requirements. When you do the continuous threat modeling, you run your SAST, test, SCA, and the pen test, and then you look at the gaps you found there, you feed them back into the threat model, right? So now, if it was an application that was already built, great. I mean, hopefully you have a diagram. If you don't, you can go make one. The challenge with applications that are already built is if you're going to go do the requirements level threat modeling, there's going to be this thing is already built. It's got hundreds of requirements that are already built into the application. So it's going to be a fairly time-consuming exercise. Whereas if it was a new application, well, every sprint, there's a small handful of new features that are going in. So it's easier to do it as you're building it, right? And when does the AppSec team get involved? Well, they should get involved at all 3 of those stages, but at the right amount of time, because there's not enough AppSec people, right? So with the architecture threat modeling, what I usually say is, if you change the design, what does that mean? If you add a new function, add a new component, a new interface, a new data store, or third-party integration, to me, that's a design change. Come talk to the AppSec team. Come talk to me. You've changed the design, right? I make it easy for the devs. Give them those 4 triggers. If you're changing those, design has changed, come talk to us. We need to look at your architecture threat model, right? In terms of user stories, if you have a new user story, well, I usually give them a filter list, right? As we were talking about earlier. Hey, run this filter on your user stories and tell me if it's worth a conversation. And that filter is like, hey, this user story handles some really sensitive data. It involves a security function. It's external facing. Then let's have a conversation. And then in the third type of threat modeling, hey, when you run your SAST-SCA, what vulnerabilities did you find? Which one of them could pose a high risk? And then let's have that conversation with respect to threat modeling.
And I think a part of the way I would try to answer that too is just avoid the scope creep of we're adding this third-party integration, or we're adding this new feature use case to this legacy system. Don't turn that into discussion about everything else that isn't that specific use case. With the caveat, and this becomes more reactive, you get a bug bounty finding, you get an internal pen testing finding. That's the way to decide why did this bug happen? Is there a better way to tackle this type of bug? And that is a way to sneak in a threat modeling conversation about a system, but that's a little bit more opportunistic, but it has to be done in the sense of, are we going to take the time to actually deal with this? Or is the point of this threat model just to record and capture our concerns and then leave the concerns on the floor and walk away? We are running out of time. And in the spirit of that, Farshad, I want to ask, when do you know you're done with a threat model? Or is that even a well-formed question?
When do you know you're done? I mean, when you stop changing the system. Any moment that you change the system, a security posture changes, but not every change changes the security posture, right? Like if going back to that
part of my question, let me interrupt too, is part of this question too is, I understand where you're coming from, but also how long do you have that conversation with developers? Is this a 1 hour conversation? Is this an 8 hour conversation? Is this go on a week and so on?
It depends on the type of threat modeling. So if you're doing the architecture threat modeling, that'd be done best in a 1 hour, at least workshop, whiteboards, that kind of stuff. If you're doing the user threat modeling, we pump those out. I mean, usually with our clients, we meet with them once a week or once every other week because they're usually following 2-week sprints. And they don't bring every user story. They bring the filtered version. So they run our filter off, without us, and then they bring in the subset, and then we get into an hour call with them and go through the evil stories with them. And we usually do it with a mentorship lens, and we see developers learn and start doing it on their own after we've done a few sessions with them. And then in terms of the continuous threat modeling, getting metrics from your bug bounty and pen test and SAST-SCA, that should be done continuously and fed back into the threat model.
Well, we're going to have you back on continuously, Farshad, because we're out of time right now, though. But before we let you leave, one of the things we've been asking all of our guests is to describe AppSec in 3 words. So we've done a lot of numbers today. You've only got 3, and they have to be words. What have you got?
Fast-moving target.
I love it. Fast-moving target that's...
Especially with vibe coding. It's faster and faster.
There we go. And it also, we'll have a separate conversation about the fast zombies versus slow zombies as our 28 days later callback too. But fast-moving target, thank you very much, Farshad. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks as well to John and Kalyani. Thanks everyone for listening. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Farshad Abasi about threat modeling, the importance of process rather than words, than dictionaries, how to avoid dying by checklists or zombies, and how to ask questions that make the best use of everyone's time, developers and AppSec teams alike. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Kalyani Pawar, and we're talking about lots of news this week. And one of the things, thankfully, we're able to talk in person and stream this because we don't have an outage at the moment. But if we were trying to do this last week and we were anywhere near GCP, things would have been a little bit tougher. And I wanted to pull in this outage article to be clear, not because it was related to a security incident. It was not. But I think it has some AppSec adjacent, or maybe even more AppSec direct lessons for us. For me, the lessons come from the idea of transparency and communication, in the sense of Google wrote up a postmortem. Cloudflare also wrote up a great postmortem that's explaining, with transparency, this is what happened. And these are some admittedly high-level changes that they describe. This is a public blog posts. but this is what we're going to do different. This is how we're going to change our practices. There's a little bit of polite underbussing, I'll say, in the Cloudflare one about we want to use our own infrastructure and not a third party's. So there's a little bit of that. But the reason I'm harping on this is that if there were a security incident, this type of communication from a postmortem is one of the things that CISA is trying to extol in their secure by design, secure by default, all of their documentation. And it's a lot richer than just we take your security seriously. It's we take your security seriously, comma, and here's what we're going to do differently. And the do differently is also what's a nice write-up here. So that's why I really enjoyed this. And it gives me some stuff to read and think about while I'm waiting for my Slack to load up again, because it wasn't DNS, it wasn't assert, and it wasn't US East 1 this time. It was GCP. But
should be running your own Slack server. You wouldn't have had that problem. Where do we want to go? So I also posted an article in here. So that was the retro from Google on this event. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 we wills on how they will fix this going forward. Yeah, so they got the retro the mini retro was out on the 13th, which I think is Friday, right? Yeah. Got it out quickly, clear, obvious, not obvious, but they're being transparent, as you said. That's great. We all make mistakes. The mistakes we make at the hyperscaler scale are obviously a little different, and they hit
more impactful.
A pretty painful way. I think to bring it back sort of to the security aspect side of things is there's some great topics, and this might be another whole episode talking about some of the hyperscaler issues. But at the core, from an AppSec point of view, you had a empty string that turned into a null pointer error. That's we have to have unit tests on things, and I do it, we all do it. I mean, these are the things which the LLMs are good at doing now. We claim is like, hey, go write like some unit tests to make sure that if you put an idiot value in here, what happens to it? So I'm not wagging my finger, even though I got my fingers up. But how do we deal with this? How do we? I'm not going to say get rid of it, right? Because like they said, we will try to. Will never be perfect. But how do you have to test for this, and how do you catch this before it gets so far down your pipeline that you just took you out if you're a large scale, and let's not say a hyperscaler, but if you're a large customer that has maybe 2 cloud providers, or maybe you're in 3 or 4 regions around the world. So relatively, that's a common thing. So how do you catch this in that type of environment before you're in prod?
And the aspect there too is not only was this, as you point out, null pointer, they're also describing a breakdown in process. So on the one hand, maybe there's already that breakdown in process that this didn't have robust test cases around it. But in their write-up, they're also saying normally we have feature flags that we can roll things out like with a feature flag, but we didn't do that this time. And that's a little bit of why? Why? This is the what are toddlers, 3-year-olds? How young do we have to be to just keep asking why? Why?
So,
why?
That's an interesting one. I'll say there is a school of thought out there that so I'm someone who, from my background, I love feature flags, but there is a school of thought out there, if you are running at large scale, that feature flags are actually a bad thing, because that means either you're changing something in production without it going through a pipeline, or you've got some sort of separate push that you've done, so you're not going to be able to actually change that thing quickly. So there's that school of thought basically says, if we're going to turn something on or off in prod, that's going to go through the same deployment as we'd usually do. So that's an extra check and balance. It would have slowed them down here, but would that have been maybe helped in another situation? It's if you're going to drink the feature flag Kool-Aid, sure, awesome, great. But my point is just don't think it's all roses.
Yeah, and I think I read the Risky Business newsletter. It's a great source for a lot of articles, and they did make a point about, or made that comparison to, in the sense of, here's a bug, here's feature flags that were not used, and here's a non-staggered rollout, which seemed reminiscent of the CrowdStrike outage that happened, what was it, just this last summer. How things change. But also a good call out to sign up for the Risky Business newsletter, because it's a great source of news. But we can't spend all of our time on GCP, especially when we have a world of LLMs out there. We have to cover LLMs and prompt injection. I have one that is called EchoLeak. This is from aim.security that has a nice, well-written article about this, what they call EchoLeak, which is what they describe as the first zero-click AI vuln enabling data exfiltration from Microsoft 365 Copilot. So a bit of a mouthful. But for me, reading through it, you could almost just say this was the first, it's a zero-click XSS, and it's just being able to send an email that turns into an image tag that exfiltrates data in a URL parameter to SharePoint. And the reason I'm framing it that way is that a lot of it doesn't feel like Microsoft completely had a cascade of avoidable errors. It feels like reading through, they had some security boundaries that were well designed, but they had some implementation mistakes. Admittedly, as this article is pointing out, with Markdown, it seems like Microsoft didn't appreciate or didn't have the same security controls around links created from Markdown using link refs, as opposed to just raw links, which is not a corner case of how Markdown exists. And that was pretty surprising. But I think the one other thing I'll add here is, yes, it's a zero click, but the attack essentially boils down to attacker sends me, a victim, an email. I receive the email. I don't have to care about it. Me as a user with Copilot makes some search. I want to look for when is 28 days later coming out. And Copilot goes and looks around, and Copilot sees this attacker's email, and then in the result set creates an image that points to the attacker-controlled SharePoint and leaks out some data that is within my Copilot data environment. So the attacker, there's no zero click, but the attacker does need to interact with Copilot, but they have no idea what's going on here. So it's a good finding, but it feels a lot like cross-site scripting. I don't know. Am I downplaying this too much, Kalyani? What are you thinking of here?
Okay, so you're not downplaying it. It feels like it does not feel like a new flavor was required, like LLM scope violation, but this absolutely requires eyes on it. And I feel like Markdown rendering has been around for over a decade. It's just that LLM seems to make a new entry point to it. While I say that, I also feel like, sure, Microsoft had good guardrails in place, but relying on a CSP to, avoid rendering a hallucinated, risky image feels like, using Helmet to avoid a crash. If I could make, if that parallel makes any sense, it feels like a guardrail, but not very much so as a fix to a image rendering problem. That's where I come from when I read this article.
Yeah, and I think I was actually surprised that, CSP actually was a good boundary here. And to be fair, CSP is a way to prevent exploitation of cross-site scripting or minimize the impact of exploitation. It doesn't defeat the source of cross-site scripting, or in this case, LLM, kind of equivalent to cross-site scripting. But rather than spend too much time on the EchoLeak, let's pull in another LLM-related attack that was actually pretty more novel, at least to my eyes. This was the TokenBreak attack from Hidden Layer, which we've covered a couple of their articles the last couple of weeks as it is. So this is a new one. But TokenBreak was cool because they're pointing out there are, broadly speaking, the LLM models out there have three different approaches to tokenizing. And tokenizing, in this sense, basically means how do we split up words? So what they had was some playing with prompt injection. And rather than just start off with the classic ignore previous instructions, they did a very small typo that we as humans could easily still understand. Ignore previous fin instructions. They just threw an F in front of instructions. And what they found is that depending on the tokenizer, the classifier that's trying to say, oops, hey, somebody's trying to prompt injection attack against you, it missed it. And it missed it when it was using what's called either BPE or word piece, which are breaking down the words, creating tokens in a way that is not on, that is less on word boundaries and more, as the article tries to describe, a way of saying, is this sequence of characters a word, a bit of a word, a bit more of a word, and kind of aggregates onto it, as opposed to the unigram approach, which was not defeated by this token break attack, which was a way to look at words, tokens, and basically start removing them and to say, is the sense of this, and I'm trying not to anthropomorphize it too much, but is the sense of this corpus changing a lot or not? I'm going to pause there and just try to pull back to the idea of, I know I'm losing the explanation here. It's mostly just say, did that fin instructions look like the word instructions? Or did it look like three words like fin, struct, and ions? And the nuance there is, if we have a observer, an LLM that's saying, look out for prompt injection attacks, and the observer says, oh, this doesn't look like the phrase ignore that fin structs and ions, it's going to miss it. And that's what they discovered. Whereas some of the models, if they are using that unigram tokenizer, they're defended against it. So let me retry the explanation here and saying, it's a model, it's attacking some fundamental properties of how models are put together, which I think is pretty cool, but also means there's a pretty solid defense against it, which in the world of LLMs, and if we throw out the non-deterministic versus deterministic, it feels much more deterministic and reliable as a security measure. So that to me is what sounds cool. So I've exhausted myself trying to put together my own string of tokens, and who knows if anybody can understand what I was just saying. Help me out here, John. What's going on?
I think Kalyani had something on her mind, so I'm going to let her go
Okay,
first.
yeah, let's look at Kalyani.
Okay, I think so. First of all, I feel like TokenBreak squarely falls under the category of prompt injection. It just looks like another flavor of token smuggling, right? I think the basic problem here is with how tokenizers work, how LLMs work, is because they cannot tell the difference between intent versus accident. For example, finstruction, it's the intent here was to beat the security policy of ignore previous instructions, and so adding the F, it was confused, like, is this just seems like a blatant accident, and let me just treat this as instruction. And because of the way the tokenizers work, unigram felt more resilient than BPE or word peace. But that also makes me think that, can you is it always feasible to move your tokenizer to the unigram type, or should you be first testing on a more adversarial corpus? Like, what is the right way out of here? Because say instruction was finstruction, or idiot was idiot, or drop was just X drop, like all of these different combinations. So do we go crazy with first testing, or do we re-architecture? What's the way out?
And I think that's a great way to pull in the other article from the Google Online Security blog about mitigating prompt injections. But before we get into that, I think, John, you had a reaction to it. He was just saying.
Yeah, sorry, I'm still playing my mic here. So based off what Kelly was just saying, is how many of the folks out there, how many people who are using an LLM today as part of their application actually know that there's a tokenizer there?
Good question.
So that's part one. And then I'm thinking about who's the threat actor on something like this. So not for this particular case, but think about going a little further. Is this type of thing that nation states are going to start playing with? Because you have to have a pretty big resource budget to be able to dive this deep into an application and understand, oh, they're using this tokenizer. Well, they're using this LLM, uses this tokenizer. Hey, I found a new way to do something, and actually be able to craft a very, very targeted but probably expensive and valuable attack. So I'm curious to see if we start seeing that type of thing in the next year or so.
I think too, it also brings up the question, as Kalyani pointed out, is how do we defend against this? We can either say, well, we're going to just have our model use all this unigram approach that is foundationally defending against this. So there's a way to get rid of an attack class, and here's why I want to bring in the recent Google security blog article about the layered approach that they take, and they lay out 5 different steps. And once again, to me, the article almost sounds like it's talking about cross-site scripting instead of LLMs. The first part they talk about is that prompt injection content classifiers, and this is where, do you have another LLM that's just trying to say this looks like prompt injection, don't look at it, or as they point out, a lot of it is like, this is a spam problem. This is a phishing problem, which we've had a machine learning for. So yes, AI, but obviously a very different flavor of AI. That's, as their blog points out, has been 99.9, so 3 nines of success against that. I am curious if that's a rhetorical 3 nines or if that's actual the numbers that they have, because once you get into billions of emails, a 0.1% still becomes pretty big. So you can't just rely on just basically a fancy regex and say this was a prompt injection. And they don't. That's why they have steps 2 through 5. And I think the other broad thing I wanted to pull out of this article is items 4 and 5 talk about a user confirmation framework and end user security mitigation notifications. I think the way they're presented here in the blog post are good. My reticence or the awareness or my spidey sense that starts tingling anytime I see a user confirmation framework is, are you just shifting the burden onto the user? Are you just saying, hey, user, something bad is here, figure out if it's bad or not? And that's where we have the classic phishing of, hey, just figure out, look at this link, parse your RFC, was it 3389, because everybody memorizes that, and figure out if it's a safe link to click or not. It's the evil bit RFC, which I think is the bad way to have user confirmation. The good way is to say, we had some indicators that this was bad, or this looks like it's going to transfer some money for you, as a bit of a callback to maybe a tenuous callback to our conversation with Farshad. But those are healthier ways or more successful ways to bring the users into this type of discussion or security decision. So, yeah.
So this is again sort of Kalyani, this is again sort of a scale issue, right? So 3 nines at scale, 3 nines is nothing. That's like, if my product was 3 nines, yeah, it'd be horrible. But so so where I'm going with this is how you do, I'm going to just talk about fraud for a second, just make it really general. How you do fraud, response to fraud. If I can weed out 3 nines and have those customers go on their way and just not be bothered, and then that 0.01, that then gets the question of either a CAPTCHA or like whatever the LLM version of a CAPTCHA is. Now you're sort of minimizing that, and hopefully that'll get better than 3 nines still. But it doesn't sound as bad as your first taught to me. But Kalyani, you had a thought in your mind.
I was just gonna say that don't you think this is just AppSec 101? Aren't we just talking about scoping and trust boundaries and input validation and output validation and sanitization? And it just feels like LLMs are the same system. It just looks slightly more complex. And given that this is Gemini, which it literally has access to your docs and emails, so the risk here is kind of high. But when I read the user notification part, it just reminded me of those emails that Google sends when you sign in from a new browser, and I'm like, you don't have to be so paranoid. I mean, it was just me doing my things. I get the perspective, but it feels like AppSec 101 to me more than here is what we're doing to mitigate prompt injection.
And it's funny to that point is even step 3 it calls out markdown sanitization and suspicious URL redaction. Those are you don't need an LLM to do that. Those are very cross-site scripting like countermeasures as well. And to your point, Kalyani, there's that balance. And this is what I was also trying to tease out when I was saying about how much of a user notification framework do we have? Are we just going to bludgeon them with a lot of alerts that they just start to snooze because there's alert fatigue? That's a very common problem. Or do we have a lot of jargon in there that says, oh, look, this is a blah, 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 AppSec, fancy word, OWASP top 10 reference, stride dread, this is a repudiation, denial of service execution problem. Do you want to, allow yes or no? Who even knows? So that's part of one of my soapboxes about what's the content of these notifications. And there was something else that I was going to mention as well. Oh, but I think the one thing that if we're talking about like user use cases and user stories from Farshad, the one thing that has changed here is that LLMs have introduced no longer can we have a separation of code and data. Code is everywhere because that prompt can come through the email address, the subject, the content, if it's white text, a white font on a white background, if it's on non-printable characters, or if it's using terminal codes. And someone's at some point going to figure out how to put the prompt within the username of the email, or in in a DNS entry at some point, or the text value of a DNS entry. I'm kind of beating a dead horse there, but the prompts can come from anywhere. They're coming from inside the house, to riff back to my horror movie references here. So that's, I think, the one thing that's changed. But otherwise, Kalyani, I kind of agree. There's a lot of 101 here. Speaking of 101, I'm going to use that to segue to another Google-related article. This was written up by BruteCat. Here's a blog post about brute forcing the phone number of any Google user. So related to Google, but also just related to very simple type of brute force attack that we all know of as possible. But one of the things I thought was wonderful about this, and that I like to look at when I see researchers write up there how I hacked this, is what was their hypothesis, or what were they thinking about? What was on their mind in the sense of, I worried about, how IDN in international, it works in DNS, or I thought about my iPhone this week. In this case, to quote, a few months ago, I disabled JavaScript on my browser while testing if there were any Google services left that still worked. And who does that? Who even expects that this websites can work without JavaScript in the year 2025? But clearly there are good reasons for that. But I just thought that was a great start to what turned out to be a brute force attack that was not just, hey, I can send a million requests, or some large number of requests in a short amount of time. It wasn't purely volumetric. It was very clever in how the researcher broke down what they were targeting and refine the brute force to honestly be successful. So this was a $5,000 worth of effort that was written up in an article. So I guess really I just wanted to highlight it. I like the article. To Kalyani's point, all that AppSec 101 still works in a couple cases, even for large companies with mature security like Google, in fact.
I think something I want to add, though, is that even if we have AI agents hacking right now, it feels like they will go after like the boring stuff, and there is still demand for the things that are missed by the AI agents, like the broken business logic or authentication flaws and things like that. And I feel like this article just brings us back to it with forgotten subdomain is something your AI agents can do, the boring stuff. But like this new fresh to your eyes kind of stuff is something that humans are always going to be good at.
Yes, and that's
versus AI race.
That'll be our new podcast slogan, ASW, we cover the boring stuff. I'm sure that's what everybody wants to read. But that's a good point. Maybe there is that aspect of, what were the edge cases that might have been missed that would be great for fuzzing. I'm going to mention that. I'm going to tease fuzzing a little bit. We're going to talk about that next week with a guest. Or just what is something we can spend some CPU cycles for an LLM to go look at 24/7 that humans honestly will find boring and may not make $5,000 with. But related to this, and here's the final article I wanted to pull in, there's a cool new CTF out there. This is CodeAuditor CTF. Now it's very heavy on the C and C++. So if you're not a C++ fan, there is still something out there that I think is useful. If you click on the Learn link, there's a lot. It's a really good write-up of just some practices, some approaches to thinking about, here is a page of code, here is a repo, here's a ton of source code. What should I be looking for? And it's not so generic as stride and dread, once again, what we were talking about last segment with Farshad, nor is it so generic of an OWASP top 10, which admittedly I also appreciate. It dives into very practical things. Look for this. Look for here are some principles of software design. Here are how developers think about creating applications. It touches on threat modeling and so on. So even if you don't want to touch any C++ code, even if you don't want to try and get anywhere above a 0 on the CTF points, read through the Learn. And I think that will be a really good introduction to just some good ways of how to approach thinking about security from a code perspective. So that's the final message I wanted to leave on that one for the day.
Yeah, I saw that part in there too about threat modeling, and I thought that would be a fun flashback with what we had Farshad on here.
Yeah, I'm curious too, how much of this, John or Kalyani, either do you do these days in the sense of security specific code reviews or just code reviews in general that happen to have a security eye? And the reason I make that distinction is, do we need an AppSec person whose role is to just look at code all the time? Or is this I'm trying to avoid shift left, or is this something that we should throw this CTF over to our developers and have them start to understand, you're writing code, you're thinking about code. By the way, in addition to null pointers, here's a couple of other things and failure modes you should have in mind. How would you use this CTF with your friends and neighbors? Let me ask it that way.
She's not sure. There's a thought there. She's thinking. So I'll go first. I like, so I'm trying to remember the non-work phrase. If you find like a developer on your team who is, they're interested in security, I'd throw this to them and give them the bone and let them go and dig. I think that's a great way to get going. I do look at code reviews, or I do review code of my team. If I'm either bored or if I see a pull request go by, I'm like, oh, what's that? I'll go and look, and these guys are amazing. I'm not going to find security issues with their code, but excuse me, I will look. I will trust our AppSec folks, or I'll go and ping them and say, hey, what's going on here? Or do we need to look at this closer, or things like that? Yeah, as I've said before, it's interesting where I am now, because I went from being a security person who was like, that was my job, to now like security people are like, they're usually causing me trouble, but still I'll look and see. But I think it's more interesting to have not so much me or any of us do it, but like the more I can get the developers doing this, I think that's great. Or excuse me, let me be clear there. The more I can get the developers to think about this, I don't necessarily want them to be doing, they do review each other's codes and the PRs for approvals and things like that, but just to be thinking about, hey, is this a security issue, I think that's a great jump to make.
Yeah, I think that answers my question too. It's more of just, this is just a code review, and it's not like we have to do a code review and then we have to do the security review and then we have to do the threat modeling and the continuous threat modeling. Then we have to update our threat model. It's more of just, security is part of software quality.
It's the mindset, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So, Kalyani, we've given you a chance to think, and we're getting low on time, so you get to take us out with some final thoughts. What is something you want to leave for our listeners this week?
Oh, I was just gonna say that as a small team, working at different kinds of startups throughout my life, I feel like the less code reviews that I have to see, it's the better, because I'm dabbling way too many things on the side. As long as the code review does not have anything to do with like buffer overflow or something like that, yeah, I don't think it needs my eyes. But for something like the CodeAuditor CTF, I think this would be a good training kind of a tool if I could use that, or have the security champions propagated through the whole team with the other developers. But yeah, and my parting thought for today is, don't forget your AppSec 101s. We're not going to be out of job anytime soon.
No. And to your point too, I'd also say, if the code review, hopefully you don't have to spend your time looking for those buffer overflows, because your LLVM, your compiler, or your linter is going to find that for you. Focus that time on what's the use case, what's the functional, like the business function, the business feature. That's probably the thing I want to reinforce that you were just saying, so we can save everybody time. So thank you for that, Kalyani. I want to say thank you to John as well. Both of them have been helpful for me walking through and tokenizing my way through some of the articles today. We'll do some better. I'll do some better explanations there and stop stumbling over my words like the zombie brain that I am. In any case, please do remember to subscribe, check out the show notes, share us on the socials, and speaking of time, check out ... Now by Das Mortal, also a Canadian. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.